Hi everybody, and welcome to our Apprenticeship Service webinar today. In our session, we're going to be having a look at the changes to the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework, and this webinar is aimed at training providers. My name is Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team. I'll be doing the hosting today, and can I, as I usually do at the start of the webinars, just remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded, and remind you that by registering and attending today, you're giving your consent and you're agreeing for the webinar to be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And if you feel that you've changed your mind regarding that consent, can I please ask that you dial off? As for the recording of the session, I'll tell you how you can access those, but I'll do that a little bit later on as we move through today's webinar. Hopefully you'll all notice that you've all automatically been placed on mute, and you'll stay on mute throughout the webinar. Our plan today is that we're going to be having a look at what's going on with the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework. We'll be going through some of the key changes that are being made, and we'll be highlighting the stuff that's staying the same. And the guys that are doing the presenting are also going to be looking at how Ofsted's reform fits within that apprenticeship accountability. So once we've done all of that, what we'll do is we'll go through into our Q&A session. And then once we're done with the Q&A session, I'll let you know how you can access a handout from today's session. And on that handout, you'll have lots of key links that we'll be referring to during the session. And then as we close, I'd like to give you a very quick update on the upcoming National Apprenticeship Week. So if you've got questions for the presenters today, you can pop them into the questions tab on your control panel. You see this, you should see this on the right hand side of your screen. Look for the heading called questions, and if you click on that, you can put your questions in there. And what we'll try and do with the Q&A session is we'll try and get through as many of the questions as we can. We'll aim to cover all of the main points that you raise, even if we don't get around to asking each individual question. And if we've got any questions that we don't get around to answering today, what I'll ask is our presenters, I'll ask them to review the questions and then issue a few points of clarification by email after the webinar. And in order so we get to as many questions as we can, we won't cover questions that don't relate to today's topic. So we're scheduled today for about 60 minutes. I'm not sure where we'll sit within that, but shouldn't be any longer than 60 minutes. Can I also remind you that as we end the session today, as you leave the webinar, you'll be directed to a short survey. Please take a couple of minutes to tell us what you thought about today's webinar and answer a few quick questions and give us your feedback. Okay, so I'm joined by Joe Cairns and Paul Burke from the Market Strategy and Provider and Employer Quality team, and they're going to be doing most of the talking today. And we've also got Sarah Tolk, who heads up that team, who will pitch in with the questions and answer panel. So welcome to all of you guys, and I think we're probably ready to start now. So Joe, I think you're up first, so I'm handing over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nick. Can I just double check that you can hear me before I kick off?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining for the session today. So, as Nick mentioned, myself and Paul sit within the Provider Market Strategy team at the Department for Education, soon to move over to the Department for Work and Pensions, and I particularly lead on the provider accountability side of things. So essentially this first part of the session, I'm just going to run through a brief introduction into the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework and why we're sort of having this session today. So essentially on this slide, it's just to go through why we're updating the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework at this time and what it actually means for providers. Paul later on is actually going to run through the Ofsted reform and how that fits in at the AAF, and then I'll sort of finish off at the end with anything that providers need to be aware of next. So hopefully pretty much everyone on the call should be aware of what the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework is. It's been in place since 2021, but I'll give a very brief overview. So the AAF is one of the department's core tools for trying to boost apprenticeship quality, and it's been designed as a risk-based, data-driven framework, and it sort of focuses on early identification of risk. And one of the main aims is to try and help providers to go through self-improvement for their apprenticeship provision. And it's now we think it's a well-established system. As I said, it's been in place since 2021. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to run through some of the ways that we're hoping to update the AAF to have some improvements to the framework. So I'll move on to the next slide. So this slide is just trying to show that since we brought in the AAF, we've seen quite a few improvements in the quality of provision. So one of the main bits of analysis we've done has found that providers who've had AAF intervention have seen greater improvements in achievement rates than providers who have not. And also we've seen since the introduction of AAF since 2021, the sort of national achievement rate, so the QAR has increased up 9.1 percentage points from 2021 to 22 up to 23-24. Obviously that's not just to do with the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework, we've got plenty of other policies we've introduced at the same time, and also it's to do with a lot of the hard work of the providers and the sector, but we think that the AAF has sort of helped support that. Similarly, we've also seen now that the majority of providers are classed as good or outstanding in Ofsted, and also most apprentices are training under those sort of good or outstanding providers. So this slide's just to sort of say we know that the AAF is currently working. So we're not trying in these updates. We're not trying to sort of have a huge change to the AAF. It's more just about sort of iterative improvements as we go along. So move on to the next slide. So this slide is just to show that the core principles of the AAF are not changing. So we still have the sort of main 5 core principles that are remaining the same. So decisions will remain data-driven and risk-based. We'll focus on timeliness and proportionality for any decisions that are made. And also one of the core things that that's going to remain the same is that we see the AAF as mainly being a way to sort of support providers' self-improvement. So none of these core policy principles will be changing in these AAF updates. As I say, it's more just iterative changes and hopefully some improvements for providers and our account managers who use the AAF. We'll move on to the next slide. And again, this slide is just to reiterate that these changes reflect a maturing programme, not any shift in expectations. So we're not these changes don't represent higher or lower expectations of providers. The bar of the quality that we're setting hasn't moved. What's changed is that the system has matured, and some of the indicators that we had originally included, some of them may not be adding as much value as they once did, or they're not sort of highlighting quality. So these are a few things that we've reviewed, and we're also trying to hopefully sharpen our focus so that attention is directed at the issues that matter most for apprenticeship quality. Okay, so we move on to the next slide. So this slide is just to show one of the reasons that we are making updates to the AAF at this point is, I'm sure you'll be aware that Ofsted are introducing a new inspection framework, and we knew that this would require us to update our Ofsted intervention policy to assure alignment. So Paul's going to go through that in the next few slides, some more detail on that. But we also thought, rather than making this update in isolation, we wanted to take the opportunity to look across the accountability framework more broadly and ask whether there are any sort of sensible improvements that we could make at the same time. And this included identifying any areas where indicators no longer add value, or where any sort of small practical changes would improve the clarity or focus, or maybe streamline the framework. And we're clear that some of these changes that we're going to make, that I'm going to run through, aren't the sort of final changes we're going to make to the AAF. It's an iterative process. We're going to continue to review the framework, and we're always keen to hear sort of feedback from providers to sort of make sure that we can sort of keep updating the AAF to make sure it's fit for purpose. So next I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Paul Burke. So he's going to run through the Ofsted intervention policy in more detail, and then I'll come back to go through some more detail on the other AAF changes. So Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Joe. Just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah, got you loud and clear, Paul.
Brilliant, thank you. So just quick introduction. So my name's Paul Burke. So again, work within the same team as Joe. My main lead is around provider support. So I have responsibility for the relationship that we've got with Ofsted around their inspection framework of work-based learning, and also some of you may be aware of the apprenticeship workforce development program. So also have responsibility for for the rollout of that as well, and making sure that is fit for purpose and is the right program for providers to help with their improvement as well. So if we just move on to the first slide. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is just a bit of a reflection on the changes that Ofsted have made to their inspection framework, how that is going to impact on our accountability framework and how it fits in with that, and then how that also in turn then reflects our updated intervention policy as well. So in terms of what's changing, you'll be aware that Ofsted completed their consultation process last year. There were two main things that came out of that consultation process. One was around an expectation of removal of the single grade judgments, and another big thing that came out of those consultation responses was about having more transparency over a provider's delivery, so looking at different areas and being able to see how they perform. So that's kind of where Ofsted have landed in terms of their new inspection process. So we've now got the new scorecard that you will all be aware of. So there'll be the introduction of those report cards with multiple judgments. And I'll go through those just really quickly for those judgment areas in a couple of minutes time, and just it explains the areas that we will be looking at as part of intervention. And you'll know that those are part of a 5-point grading scale for all areas. The only exception to that is around safeguarding, which will remain as met or not met. So in terms of providers that will be delivering our programs, for apprenticeship only providers, the majority of apprenticeship only providers will receive 6 judgments. For FE colleges and designated institutions, they may receive up to 16 judgments. So that will be if they're delivering all of the programs that we offer and that Ofsted inspect. And I'll talk a bit more about this on the next slide, but they will also be judged against their contribution to meeting skills needs as well. There'll also be a short narrative alongside those grades, and the inspection cycle will be broadly unchanged. So there'll be a maximum 5-year interval between inspections. In terms of what that means for the AAF, and again, I'll talk about this a bit more as we go through the slides on how that's changing. But in terms of the principles, as Joe said, they will remain the same. The changes that we're making here to our intervention policy and how that fits into the accountability framework will remain the same. The principles behind that will not change. The new grades will replace former judgments as intervention triggers. So we've also been clear, and Ofsted have been really clear, that there isn't a read across between the old process and the new process. But what we're really clear on is that we're still our kind of fundamental principle is still around quality and making sure that we're improving the quality of the program. And the action that we will take will be based on the severity of the issue, what risk that presents, and what impact that will have on learners. It won't just be about the labels of those inspections alone. We will take those other things into context when we make decisions. What we're also very aware of is this is a big change for providers. It's happened very quickly. So in terms of when the announcement was made and the new process being put into place, that's happened quite quickly. So we will be proportionate in the decisions that we make. It will be on a case-by-case approach, especially during the transition period from the old to the new. So in the first kind of 12 months of the delivery of the new programme. We've always been proportionate and had a case-by-case approach, but we'll be especially mindful of that during the transition period. So if we could just move on, I'll just really quickly run through what the scorecard looks like and how we'll address that. So at a whole provider level, you'll be aware that every organisation will be assessed at whole provider level on those first 3 areas, so leadership and governance, inclusion and safeguarding. For colleges and designated institutions, they will have that also be judged on contribution to meeting skills needs. What we've agreed in the first part of transition to the new framework is that for work-based learning delivery, we won't be considering contribution to meeting skills needs as part of our intervention policy. So we will be looking at those grades, but we won't be taking a view in terms of what intervention we might make dependent on that grade. And that's because especially with the apprenticeship program is employer-led. So at the moment, we're not going to be looking at that kind of contribution to meeting local skills needs. It may be something we consider in the future, but at the moment, at a whole provider level, we'll be looking at those 3 other areas, which all organisations will be judged on. And then at provision type level, you'll be aware there are 3 of those: so curriculum, teaching and training, achievement, and participation and development. And again, we will be considering those as part of our kind of intervention policy and where providers will land on the AAF. If we just move on. So I'll just talk a little bit about what those judgments will mean and how they will fit alongside the accountability framework. So as I said, we will be looking at those provider level and provision level judgments when we take decisions. What we will be looking at is areas that indicate serious and systematic quality concerns. So not just looking at the labels, but looking at actually what does that mean. And we will be really clear, and as we have been previously, that we'll be looking at safeguarding outcomes where standards are not met. So where, as we have previously, where there are serious safeguarding concerns, then we will look at action will be taken. So the judgments that we take will be considered alongside the other data that we hold as part of the accountability framework, and won't be in isolation. As I've said, we will take account of scale, persistence of those issues. All of those things will be taken into account when we take a decision. And the real focus for us is on the impact of learner outcomes and their experience. That's what's at the heart of the decisions that we make. Decisions, as they have been previously, will remain risk-based and proportionate. They'll be informed by that wider context and performance trends of the provider, and really clearly we'll be making sure that those decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, making sure we use that professional judgment. And as I've already said, we'll be really pragmatic in our approach during the first 12 months of the framework, and we won't make automatic changes to that intervention without that clear evidence risk. We'll be making sure that we take all those things into account. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just give a bit more detail into what those Ofsted judgments are likely to translate into. So as we've said, the Ofsted framework doesn't change the accountability expectations; those remain the same. Where there are serious issues, then we will take action, and those decisions will be risk-based, proportionate, and focused on the impact for learners. So, in terms of what that means, so where a provider has an urgent improvement judgment, we will, from an accountability framework perspective, that will put a provider at risk and will normally result in strong contractual action, which could mean potential termination. What we want to be really clear on in these circumstances is we do have the right to be able to take a different course of contractual action outside of termination if we believe that is the right action to take. So the provider agreement will be really clear upon that. But as previously, where there are a kind of serious quality concerns, that will normally lead to termination of providers, but we will look at other elements as well when taking a decision. So that's kind of the serious quality concerns where we see urgent improvement. In terms of needs attention judgments, we believe that does signal an increased risk with providers being classed as needs improvement, but we also understand that actually there will be areas that Ofsted judges needs improvement that can be turned around quickly. So what we're kind of proposing here is where providers will fall into the needs improvement category, and that will then act as a trigger for case managers to look across the rest of the AAF measures. So we wouldn't look at those things in isolation if they aren't widespread. It would just be that would act as a trigger for case managers to be able to look across the rest of those framework areas to see what discussion needs to be had. Where it is likely that we would take action where needs improvement is prevalent is where there are repeated concerns over time, which will then lead to possibly formal intervention. So an example of that is where actually a provider has a majority of needs improvement grades across 2 consecutive inspections, where it's very clear that actually that provider isn't making changes to improve. So if that happens over 2 consecutive inspections, it is likely that we will look at some kind of formal intervention action. In terms of the transition period, as we've said, during the first 12 months, we'll be making sure that's pragmatic and case by case, and there won't be automatic escalation without the evidence of risk. So we'll be making sure we are really clear on that. And on the right hand side there, you'll see that how that translates in terms of at risk, needs improvement, and on track, and how providers may arrive there. If we just move on to the next slide, which is I think the final one. So we've added this visual in here, which really is kind of what I've said already. It just gives you a kind of process map in terms of what each Ofsted grade may translate into on the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework. So you'll see there how at risk, needs improvement, or on track are arrived at. The one thing that I didn't mention on the last slide, which you will see here, is we will take the same approach in terms of insufficient progress on new provider monitoring visits. So just to clarify that, there is a slight change in that. So insufficient progress will still be judged on new provider monitoring. What we used to call visits are now being called in the new inspection framework new provider monitoring inspections. So we will take the same approach around that, and we will look at insufficient progress and whether or not contractual action is required. So that will remain the same. Just another couple of clarifications before I hand back to Joe. So in terms of, I've given a bit of detail in terms of what those judgments will mean for our intervention policy, but this will be made really clear when we publish the updated provider agreement, so the apprenticeship provider agreement, which is expected to happen in the next few days. So we hopefully be next week, but will be certainly very soon. And you will see within that provider agreement what the action we may, what is the action we may take, and what are our other levers that we may use as well against each of those areas. So what I've explained here will be, you will see in a lot more detail as part of that updated framework. And the other thing just to add on teaching apprenticeships as well is that the bar will remain the same for teaching apprenticeships as it does for all other apprenticeships. So the quality bar will remain the same, and decisions will be on a case-by-case basis in terms of those apprenticeship standards. So the bar won't be lowered or higher for teaching apprenticeships. It will remain as it is, but those decisions will be made on a case-by-case basis. So hopefully that's given you a bit of detail in terms of the changes that we're making and how that fits into the new accountability framework. I'll hand back to Joe, and we'll take questions at the end.
Joe, just before you start your next piece, can I just remind people that if they've got questions, to please put them into the question facility. You'll find that in the control panel. And just point out, we've had quite a few questions about recordings. When will the recordings be available? Will we have links off to various different areas of gov.uk or whatever else, and slides. We are recording the session. It will be available. I'll tell you how you can access that later. We're not proposing to send out slides today. And towards the end of the session, we will have a document that you can download that has links off to all of the key areas that you'll need to access information. So I just thought I'd do that to stop some of those questions coming in. But any other questions about the accountability framework and also sort of Ofsted, please put them into the question facility, and we'll get around to those at the end of the session. Sorry, Joe, over to you.
Great, thanks, Dick, and thanks, Paul, for running through those Ofsted changes. So that's going to be one of the most significant changes, as Paul just ran through, our sort of updated Ofsted intervention policy. But as I said earlier, we wanted to take advantage of updating the framework to see if there were any things that we could change about the rest of the framework, particularly on those quality indicators. So the sort of main focus we had was, are the current quality indicators still the best way to spot risk to quality early on, and to spot the right conversation with providers? So we sort of had we looked for feedback from providers, spoke to our account managers who sort of deal with providers each day to try and get a bit of feedback on the current AAF, and to look at what could possibly be changed. So if we go on to the next slide. So as I'm sure most of you will be aware, the AAF includes a wide range of indicators that we've sort of added in since its inception in 2021. So we wanted to look at each one of these indicators to make sure that, as I said, whether they're still accurately highlighting any providers who have sort of insufficient quality. And there was a bit of a focus on, could we potentially streamline this framework and make it sort of easy to understand, and make sure that each indicator here is actually really focusing in on provider quality, learner outcomes, and hopefully we can support sort of clearer, more meaningful conversations with providers. Next slide. So this slide is just to say that we did find a few indicators and triggers that we thought we could temporarily remove as part of the review, and these were essentially because we thought that some of these indicators weren't accurately highlighting providers who were sort of insufficient, that had sort of heightened risk or insufficient quality. Again, hoping that they would simplify the framework slightly. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll go through what those indicators are. So starting with the first one, so we've got breaks in learning. So essentially the break in learning, as it is currently in the framework, was to track the sort of percentage of learners at a provider who were on a break in learning over a certain time frame. So currently it's over 180 days or over 365 days. So this was initially introduced following the pandemic, and it was because there was quite a few learners, quite a high proportion, who were on breaks in learning sort of following the pandemic. But we think that over time that this sort of risk has decreased since we've moved away from the pandemic. And currently, when we're sort of going through the data for break in learning, we can see that very few providers are actually flagging as either at risk or needs improvement as part of the framework. Obviously, the way that it's currently set up at the minute is we don't seem to think that it's working. And we also had quite a bit of feedback from providers that it was a bit confusing the way it was set out currently. So we just want to flag that at the minute we're looking to remove this, but we think it's probably only going to be a temporary measure, because we do think that tracking break in learning is still important. It's something that our team is still going to be looking at, particularly any providers that we think have a high proportion of learners that are on a break in learning. We're wary of any providers who are looking to sort of use break in learning to try and alter their qualification achievement rate for that particular year. So this is something that separately we are sort of reviewing, and we'll hopefully come back over the next few months with a sort of updated break in learning measure, which we think will better track any providers that are that have a high risk of quality regarding breaks in learning. To move on to the endpoint assessment organisation indicator. So again, currently in the current Apprenticeship Accountability Framework, the endpoint assessment organisation indicator tracks sort of the proportion of learners who don't have an endpoint assessment organisation assigned to a learner within either sort of 3 months or within 3 to 6 months of their planned end date. So one of the reasons we're looking to sort of remove that at this point is that going forwards, the department is looking to sort of shift the way that they do assessments. So it's maybe more throughout the apprenticeship rather than it all being at sort of at the end. So we think that going forwards, this indicator is going to be less relevant. Similar to breaks in learning, when we look at the stats, again, there's very few providers that are actually being flagged as at risk or on track. So again, the way the indicator is currently set out isn't really flagging providers for this indicator, sort of insufficient quality. So again, looking to see if we can remove this. This is maybe something that would simplify the framework a little bit, allow providers to focus on, and our account managers to focus on the indicators that are actually more important for flagging quality. And then the final point that we've got here is on off-the-job training. So this was originally introduced when the sort of reporting for off-the-job training from providers was quite low and inconsistent, and we've seen over time that providers have become much better at sort of actually recording their off-the-job training and reporting that. And we now think that as time has moved on, as the framework has matured, we see that the off-the-job training is maybe more of a compliance issue rather than a quality issue. So going forwards, we're looking to sort of remove this from the framework, but it is still something that's important. Obviously, providers still need to be providing the sufficient off-the-job training hours to their apprentices, but this is maybe something that we'll look to track in a different way, whether that's through the sort of audits of providers where we'll look at it that way. So, but we just want to maybe move this away from the framework, and it allows our account managers a bit more time, because it was quite burdensome for them to look through each provider's off-the-job training hours, and that might be done by a sort of separate team going forwards. So we can move on to the next slide. So the next update we're looking to make is a change to the past planned end date indicator. So at the minute, the past planned end date indicator measures apprentices who are past their planned end date for two different reasons. So the first one being apprentices who have a completion status of 1. So that means that they haven't yet completed their training. So they're still sort of undergoing their training and they're past their planned end date. And then the second one is completion status 2, which is apprentices who have completed their training, but they're past the planned end date because they're waiting for an endpoint assessment. So we had quite a bit of feedback from providers and sort of saying that they felt that it was a bit unfair that they may be flagged as some of their learners being flagged as past planned end date when they've done all that they can as a provider. You know, they've completed their they make sure their learners completed their training before the past planned end date, but there's an issue outside of their control, whether that's with the endpoint assessment and endpoint assessment organisation. So going forwards, we're looking to focus this past planned end date indicator to focus only on those apprentices with a completion status 1. So those are the learners who have yet to complete their training and are past their planned end date. And we're going to sort of exclude those learners who have got a completion status of 2. So we're hoping that this will really focus on those learners who are past the planned end date, which is within the provider's control. So yeah, hopefully this can really focus on areas of sort of genuine delivery related risk, which is to do with the providers. So this table on the right hand side gives a bit of an indication of what we're setting the thresholds to be, but you'll see more detail in updated AAF guidance, which we're hoping to release next week, so you can go through this in a lot more detail. But just to quickly go over this, we're hoping that this is a bit more of a simplified approach. We're not sort of doing this by a certain amount of days as it is currently. So it's going to hopefully be more simple in a sense of if you'll be flagged as at risk if greater than or equal to 15% of the total learners are past their planned end date and are sort of still in training. So that completion status of 1 needs improvement will be between that 10 to 15%. And if you've got less than 10%, you'll be flagged as on track. So we can move on to the next slide. So this next slide is just a flag that we've tried to make sure that when reviewing this, that the Ofsted reform that the changes that we've made and our AAF updates are going to work together to support improving quality. So Ofsted obviously provides a sort of independent assessment at a single point in time, whereas the AAF will hopefully, all these indicators will be able to provide a continuous monitoring over time. And together they'll support earlier and more proportionate intervention where needed. Next slide, please. So this slide is to show that one of the main bits of feedback that we've received both from providers and our account managers is that they would like to see a lot more contextual information included within the AAF dashboard. So this is something that we're hoping we're going to be able to bring into the dashboard over the next few months. So there's going to be a wide range of different contextual information we can hopefully provide on the dashboard. So that'll range from some provider information, so the size of the provider, their geographic location, what type of provider they are, also some learner information, so whether the provider has a high proportion of learners with a disability, for example, or they are a high proportion of learners who are care leavers, etc. Some data on the proportion of learners who are sort of undertaking the English and maths, and then also greater contextual information for each of the quality indicators. So say, for example, if we take withdrawals, hopefully when you click on it now, at the minute, you'll just sort of see that overall score. So what percent of learners are withdrawn, but hopefully going forward with the greater contextual information, we can include more of a breakdown of data. So we can sort of say the withdrawals by sector, standard, the days into the apprenticeship when they were withdrawn, hopefully potentially withdrawal reasons, and hopefully if we can sort of provide all that in an easy to access way on the AAF dashboard, that'll one, allow providers to get a lot more of this data, so again helping their self-improvement, but also will allow greater conversations between our account managers and providers when they have those management conversations, so they can hopefully provide a bit of context to why providers may be underperforming, and allow providers to sort of show potentially any reasoning, and then our account managers can potentially take that into account when they are sort of making their decisions. And so ultimately the aim of this is to sort of try to support more rounded, consistent and proportionate discussions between providers and account managers, and making sure that we've got that shared evidence base of as much data as possible. So we can move on to the next slide. So this is just to cover a bit more of what I've just mentioned on the last slide. So hopefully the updates to AAF dashboard will support better context-led discussion. So rather than just that headline figure of the indicator of how they're performing, it sort of allows that sort of the data behind that to sort of hopefully have more well-rounded conversations. Yeah, and as I said, hopefully we can have greater consistency and clarity in the conversations. So we can move on to the next slide. Just to sort of say what these changes hopefully mean for providers in practice. So as I said earlier on in the webinar, we're not expecting any change. We're not making any changes to the core quality expectations or the accountability standards. The policy principles are remaining the same. We're continuing to strive for clear and focused performance conversations, but hopefully some of these changes will provide a greater emphasis on the delivery risks that are within the provider control, and also sort of hopefully streamline a lot of these indicators. So we're sort of removing some of those indicators which we don't think are adding as much value, and still having that continued expectation on provider-led self-improvement. So go on to the next one. So this is just a bit of a summary of what is changing. So as I've run through, we're going to have a bit of a streamlined AAF quality indicators. So there's the breaking learning, the endpoint assessment organisation, and the off-the-job training indicators, which we're going to remove for now. We're going to have that refocus past planned end date measure. So that's focusing on those learners who are past their planned end date but are continuing training. So excluding those learners who have completed their training but they're past planned end date due to a reason outside of provider's control. To do the endpoint assessment. Paul's run through the updated Ofsted intervention policy, and also to mention we're hoping to include a lot more contextual information on the AAF dashboards. And then just to cover again, obviously what is staying the same is those core policy principles of the AAF, still going to be risk-based, proportionate approach to intervention with a real focus on sort of learner outcomes and quality, and still that strong expectation of provider, self-improvement. And if we just move on to the next one, just to give a bit more of an update on timings. So I think Paul mentioned earlier on that we're hoping to have an updated provider agreement, hopefully by next week. And similarly, we'll have an updated AAF guidance document on gov.uk. We're hoping it will be published at some point next week. So we can, I think there'll be a link to that at the end of these slides, and we can sort of share that. It'll be still in the same place as it currently is on gov.uk. Also hoping next week we'll be updating the AAF dashboard. So I think there was a question earlier on which mentioned these updates, one of the reasons why it's still R14 data. And yeah, that's correct. We've just been waiting slightly to have all this updated, and then hopefully next week we'll have the dashboard updated with these new indicators, and we'll have the R05 data coming in for everything other than QAR. So again, as of next week, hopefully we'll have the Ofsted intervention policy will apply from next week, and we'll start getting through the sort of first report cards from Ofsted for the under this new inspection framework. And going into later in 2026, we'll have the sort of wider dashboard improvements, which are looking to include a lot more contextual information. And to say that throughout the year we're going to be looking at other ways that we can improve the framework. We know that these changes aren't at the end. We're not in the framework won't be in a sort of perfect position. We're still going to be reviewing and updating and looking for feedback from providers. We know that there are some areas. So, for example, the employer and apprentice feedback. We know that we had a lot of feedback from providers, one on how we get more people to actually fill out that feedback, and maybe the questions. We've got a team in the department who's currently doing a review on that, so that's a bit more of a longer term improvement. We are definitely looking at that, and we know that we've got feedback regarding the sort of time lag between providers submitting their data on the ILR and then the QAR data that's sort of pulling through. So we've also got a separate team that's looking at data and how we can try and get QAR data released earlier within the year, and more regular updates of QAR. But that's hopefully we can give an update on that later in the year. Hopefully we can look to bring in some more regular updates on the QAR. But that's everything from me, so I'll hand back to Nick.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. Before we move into the Q&A bit proper, there were lots and lots of questions about the past planned end date slide, and particularly around codes 1 and 8. I just wondered whether we could just go back and have a look at that, because I think there's some questions about where is it? So learner coded gateway as 1, outcome as 8 as per the ILR spec. Will they be excluded? As you've only mentioned, code 1 continuing and outcome 9. There's something around continuing 1 but outcome 8, i.e. the training has been completed if they have actual end date but they were currently undergoing an EPA. There was something about the status listed as 1 in error, should read 1, 2 and 3. So can we just have a look at, I think was it slide 22? Can we just go back to that and have a quick look at that, Joe? Is there anything we could just add to some of those comments? Are you there?
Apologies, I was talking away on
right.
mute there. Sorry. I was just going to say, sorry, I've not had a chance to read through all these questions on the past planned end date, but I can definitely have a read through all of these, and we can maybe provide any sort of a written answer afterwards. I can go into a lot more detail. But then also just to say that we'll go into a lot more detail on the past planned end date update in the AAF guidance that we're updating. So hopefully we can provide a lot more
Okay.
detail on that, but it's probably easier if I can sort of read through all these and go through them. I can reply.
Okay.
Afterwards.
Nick, I can. Shall I just duck in, because I was looking, Joe, while you were talking.
Oh, cool.
So
thanks.
it might partly answer it. I'm not sure fully. So the bit that we're picking up on the past planned end date is about the completion statement. So we're focusing on those that are not completed and waiting to do their assessment, but actually basically past the actual end date, out of funding, and therefore higher risk, so that they're kind of staying over. And that's where the difference between code 1 and code 2, I can't remember what you got on the slide, Joe, but the learner is continuing their learning aim and activities is the code 1, and then the code 2 is that they've completed their activities leading to the learning aim, they're still on programme. And then the ILR outcome code 8 it says that the learning activities are complete, but the outcome is not yet known. So that's where there might be a gateway. So the bit where we're focusing on, and we'll check the numbers on the slide just to make sure it's not a typo, but it's really about those that are not sat waiting for assessment, but still doing their training, but past the end date of when you'd actually planned it. So they're out of funding, and they're overstayed on the original plan, and it's where we see high proportions of that it just triggers that review.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps a bit.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, Sarah. I just noticed there were lots of questions.
Yeah, no, I saw.
We might as well have a look at that if we can. Hopefully that's answered some of the questions. If it's not, then just put a comment in the bottom in the questions, and like Joe said, we can issue a point of clarification if we've either inadvertently sort of confused people or said something wrong. But yeah, add a comment in on the questions if there's still a query in your mind about it. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Paul, for your updates. Really detailed and insightful updates on AAF and what's going on in the world of Ofsted. So let's have a look at some of the questions then. So the first one I've got in is, are there any changes, or are the changes the reason the framework still only shows R14? So Joe, is that one that you could answer?
Yes, that's one we can answer. So we were due to have, I think, R04 data was available a couple of weeks ago, but we just delayed it slightly just so we can get we can do an update of the framework on the dashboard with these sort of new changes. So hopefully, if all going well, next week we'll be able to update the dashboard, and we'll have the R05 data on there for everything other than QAR, and it'll also have the updated the updated indicators, as I mentioned. So yeah, we should have an updated dashboard next week.
Cool, thank you. And then Paul, a couple of questions for you. The first one, I think this was mentioned a couple of times. A provider asking whether they're subject to Ofsted inspections as they're a teacher training provider, and so will they only have Ofsted inspections and not AAF inspections?
Yep, I can take that one. Nick, can you hear me? Okay,
yeah.
So yeah, I noticed there were a couple of questions relating to this, so I'll probably be able to answer this in one, and I can clarify it kind of further down the question list as well. But in terms of teacher apprenticeship, so firstly, so the accountability framework is very different to the kind of Ofsted inspection. The accountability framework is used by case managers to have a discussion. So organisations that are delivering teaching apprenticeships would still be subject to the framework, so they would still have those discussions with their case managers. They would still be kind of graded across those different areas. The difference is the framework in which Ofsted operates. So the framework for teaching apprenticeships is slightly different. And so what will happen with, so you'll see this in the updated provider agreement, but the bar will be the same, but the difference will be what we measure. So what we're looking at is it will be the same measure as previously for teaching apprenticeships, where the training provider has failed to ensure that the curriculum for a teaching apprenticeship doesn't meet the principles and requirements of an apprenticeship, is where we would look at those triggers. So although it is a slightly different measure, those organisations will still be subject to the accountability framework and possible intervention measures, and that is exactly the same as the previous provider agreement. Within the previous provider agreement, we were really clear on what it means for teacher apprenticeships and what that bar is, and that remains the same. So hopefully that helps.
Cool, thank you. And then another one for you. How will the AAF link to previous Ofsted inspection framework? So how will the AAF link the previous Ofsted inspection with the new one? Thinking about providers who've been inspected shortly before the new framework came into place, how will their Ofsted grading be looked at in the context of AAF?
Yep, no problem. We'll take that one as well. So we're very mindful that obviously the Ofsted, this new framework will take quite some time to embed, and it will be quite some time before all providers go through that process. So taking that into account, there'll be kind of two things around that. The accountability framework will continue to run on the old and new thresholds until a provider goes through that new process. So we will still be providers will still be on those old thresholds until they inspect them again. So they will be there for quite some time, and they will just be updated. And similar with the provider agreement. So within the provider agreement, you will see within the clauses that we've got within that contract that we have kind of pre November the 10th and post November the 10th. So anything pre November the 10th, we still will talk about the old threshold, or the old Ofsted's inspection framework, and anything post that we will look at the new. So until a provider goes through the new process, we will be looking at their old thresholds. Is the kind of quick answer.
Thank you. Joe, there was a question from your first input around scorecards on AAF. So will those scorecards be visible in your view, in the view education data?
So we have looked at whether it would be whether it's possible to have the Ofsted data on the AAF dashboard on view education data. From the feedback we've had earlier, that would sort of, there was a view that it wouldn't be that useful, but if providers, if we get the feedback that they'd like to have the Ofsted data on the dashboard, we can look into that if that's something that providers would like to see. The feedback we've had is that providers will tend to just go to sort of the Ofsted report card to sort of view that sort of Ofsted data. They wouldn't find it that useful to have it on the dashboard. But that if that's changed, if providers give us that feedback, it's something we can definitely look into.
Cool, thank you. Paul, a couple more questions for you. Something about new provider monitoring visits. So for new provider monitoring visits, will there be changes?
Yeah, that's right. So I think that question probably came just before I'd got to my last slide, Nick. So I think I answered that within the presentation. But so for new provider monitoring visits, the policy will remain the same, where if insufficient progress is made, we may potentially take contractual action.
Cool. And then there's a question there about step 3. What if the answer is no? That relates to the Ofsted judgment. How often a judgment is translated into DFE actions on slide 17. What's the response to that one?
That's fine. I had to quickly go remind myself of what that was, Nick. So I've had a look, and that would mean that would translate to providers being on track. So there wouldn't be any issues, and providers would remain on track in the AAF framework, so they wouldn't be at risk or needs improvement.
Okay, and then another one for you, Paul. A provider here has already been inspected by Ofsted in December. Not sure what support we offer to providers outside of intervention triggers. Intervention triggered by things going wrong. So is there any other support that we offer outside of the intervention triggers?
Absolutely, yes. So we'll look at how we can kind of provide a bit more information off the back of this webinar. But as I said, kind of at the start, I've also got responsibility for the kind of provider support model that we offer. So I can provide some more information about kind of tools and materials that providers can access through that as well. So we'll get a link out to that after this.
Okay, thank you. Joe, this might be one for you, I think. So there's a question about breaks in learning, about the quality indicators. So if a training provider shows as at risk or needs improvement, what will the implications of this be?
Well, breaking learning is one that we're looking to sort of remove going forwards, but I think in general, for any sort of indicator, if they're flagged as sort of needs improvement or at risk, there's various different ways that an account manager can choose intervention. So that ranges from an initial sort of management conversation, whereas an improvement plan, and that sort of goes up to sort of stopping starts to sort of stopping any funding, going all the way up to obviously terminating the contract. So there's various different interventions that can be undertaken depending on the sort of whether their needs improvement or at risk. And there's also sort of a look across. It's not just based on one indicator; it'll be based across the provider's performance across all sort of indicators. So that will and also sort of contextual information that will determine how an account manager decides on what that intervention should be.
Okay, cool. And then another one for you, Jeff, again. I think it's a plea. Can the AAF be available in the first half of the year? So we'd like both years whilst there's a bit of an overlap, but want the new year to be available sooner. Is that something that could be looked at?
It's something we can look at and take that away, take that feedback away, and we can have a look. Can't promise anything at this stage, but we'll definitely have a look at that feedback, take a note of that, and yes, work with our sort of colleagues on when we look at doing this bit of a review of the dashboard. If providers think that would be useful, that's something we can take a look at.
Is that
Okay.
the question actually AAF document or the AAF dashboard? Because it might be actually about the data, just about frequency of data, because the policy document itself, overarching, stays there. So I think that might be what it is, Joe, in relation to that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So I'm scrolling down a few, just conscious of time. I want to try and get some of the ones that were.
Nick, just to say, I can see that there's still the chat, so we will go back. So we know outcome code throughout the year, and we'll look at the completion status. The point is, so we will check, just double check language, because it might have just been some on the side. But
Okay.
the point is, we'll pick out those that are out of funding and not waiting for assessment, so they're still on programme. We'll make sure we've got the right combination in that document that comes out on Monday. So it might just be the way we summarised it today, but I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you for flagging.
I think probably one again, Joe. There's a question there about the offered job function. Don't believe that the offered job functions ever work for on AAF for this particular provider. They get a note saying new feature coming soon. Is this something that they're doing wrong, or something that isn't necessarily filtering through to them properly?
No, yeah, we appreciate there's on the actual AAF dashboard, there is one of those cells, as said, the off the job training is new features coming soon for a while, but we've not been able to sort of pull through the off the job training data onto here because it comes through a sort of separate report, and I think that's one of the reasons, as well as other sort of reasons why we're sort of taking off the job training off the AAF. So it's not going to be on the AAF dashboard going forwards, and it's something that we're going to look at potentially tracking in a different way. So not through the AAF. It'll still be an important process, but we're working with colleagues on how that's going to be tracked separately, whether that's through sort of audits or through separate teams who'll do reviews of off the job training that's submitted through the report. But we're not going to have the that off the job training pulling through onto the dashboard going forwards. We're going to take away that cell.
I've been talking to the dashboard. There was a question here from a provider asking how they find the dashboard. I know we're going to provide the link later on in a second, but could you just tell that provider where they go to access the dashboard?
Yeah, so this is a site called View Your Education Data on gov.uk, so we can send out a link for that and maybe some instructions on how you can sign up for the dashboard if they've not already done that. That's something we can definitely provide after this.
Okay, and when will the new AAF be implemented from, Joe?
So we're hoping that we'll get the dashboard, everything updated from next week, all being well. And that's when obviously we're hoping to get the new provider agreement will be updated as well. So hopefully next week on the dashboard, you'll hopefully be able to see, updated with the new, the new updated indicators, etc.
Okay, cool. I'm going to stop answering the questions, other than to say, Joe, is there anything on there that we haven't addressed so far in terms of the questions that you think we should answer quickly? Because I've got a couple of minutes left.
Not that I can see at the minute, but I can definitely. I'll just say that I'll run through a lot of these questions that are left over, and if there's anything, I can sort of write up some answers to that and make sure that everything is covered in the guidance document. So there's going to be the AAF gov.uk guidance documents hopefully going to be updated for next week, which will go into a lot more detail on these changes. Hopefully that'll cover a lot of these questions as well.
Yeah.
Cool, thank
Nick,
you.
can I just say something overall? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
so just aside from some of the technical points, I think just what we would really like providers to take away today is this is a refinement. The policy, the point of the framework is still about helping us and having you to flag where things might indicate we need a conversation and a review. It's not automated intervention, as Joe said before, and we try doing our best to look at everything on a case-by-case basis in context. We've got benchmark data and everything else remains. So the principle is there's nothing that's fundamental that's changing within the AF, just some streamlining to make sure that we're focusing on the areas of provision where there might be something we just want to kind of like monitor and keep an eye on, and have those conversations with providers where it's falling below those thresholds. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Anything from you as a key point that maybe we've not touched on yet from the questions that have been raised?
No, I don't think so. I think I've had a quick look through, and I think most of them are probably we've answered, so there should be answers there. We'll have a look through just to afterwards, and if there is anything fundamental in there that we need to address and answer, we'll make sure those come back. But
Cool.
no, I don't think there's anything major.
Thank you. So we will do that. We'll commit to then taking away those questions, having a look, and then issuing a couple of clarification points for things where either we've not addressed it or that require the clarification. So we'll take that away. So thank you everybody for submitting the questions, and thank you Paul, Sarah, and Joe for answering as many as we could through the time we had available. So guys, I know it's 1 o'clock, but just bear with me for just a couple of seconds while I go through the last slides. So we can move on to the next one. Most of you will be familiar with our YouTube channel at DFE Sector Comms. We've got 3 playlists on there for various recordings. So we've got the recording of this session will be on the Apprenticeship Service webinar recordings playlist, and that'll be in about a month, maybe 4 or 5 weeks time. And we'll also have support videos covering different functions of AS using the Apprenticeship Service playlist, and other videos created to support the delivery of apprenticeships are in the Apprenticeships support videos playlist. Go to that channel, subscribe, click on the bell icon, you get alerts when we upload new content. On the further support slide, this is the one where all the links are, but rather than you scribbling them down or having to take a screenshot, if you go to the handout section of your control panel, you can download the handout, and that will have all of the links on there. So you'll see links to apprenticeships.gov.uk for more information about apprenticeships. There's a link on there to the Further Education and Training Providers community, which is a peer-led discussion forum for providers. Our GoToWebinar link is on there as well, so you can register for future webinars. We'll also have, by the beginning of next week, a recording of today's webinar available on that link as well. So you can get the recording. We'll have that on there for about a month whilst we get the YouTube version fully accessible and put onto the YouTube channel. So yeah, so you can use that GoToWebinar link to listen to this, or get colleagues to listen to this session from the beginning of next week. If you've got any queries about the Apprenticeship Accountability Framework, you can submit those through the Customer Help portal. We've also put the links on to the Accountability Framework and to the funding rules and to the provider agreement as well. And right at the bottom, I've also put some links on there to National Apprenticeship Week, to the website for that. And there's a link in there to the site that you can download the National Apprenticeship Week toolkits. And then if anybody has any questions about National Apprenticeship Week or wants to get in touch, you can email the.week@education.gov.uk. Talking of National Apprenticeship Week, as I said, it's coming up very soon. It's in a few weeks' time, and it runs from the 9th to the 15th of February. The theme for NOR 2026 is Skills for Life and supporting the Skills for Life campaign. And that slide shows what NOR is all about. For me, what I like the best about National Apprenticeship Week is that it gives that real proper space to highlight best practice and celebrate apprenticeship success. So go to the NOR website, download the various toolkits and share them, and also use the NOR 26 event map. If you use social media, follow us and share our social media channels. And if you can, amplify any messages that we've got on social media using hashtag NOR2026 and hashtag Skills for Life. And if you're doing your own social media, share those plans with us as well, and we'll amplify your posts as well. And then finally, that slide there gives you the breakdown of all of the daily themes for National Apprenticeship Week. So that's it. I hope you've stayed with us for the last couple of minutes, even though we've run over. That's the end of our session. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the presenters for all of your input and insights. And remember, as you leave the webinar, please do complete that short survey and let us know what you thought. Goodbye, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the day.